I didn't know you would react like that.
There were two versions of Eleanor Carson, the one who showed up at the office every day, organized, competent, and professional, and the one who woke up at 3 a.m. flushed with her heart racing after dreaming about her boss, again and again. Alejandro Bentivoglio didn't do anything special. He just existed, with that voice, that look, that damn cologne. And he destroyed Eleanor completely, without even knowing it. She had a secret, one she could never reveal to him, until the day the elevator stopped on the 40th floor. Doors closed, just the two of them, and he asked, "Tell me, what is it about me that scares you?" And Eleanor, who had run away 1,000 times, who had swallowed her words, who had slept poorly for 2 years keeping it inside, couldn't take it anymore. The words came out before she could hold them back, and the world stopped. "Hi, I'm Lena, the owner of this channel. Yes, I understand you guys don't really like these comments I make throughout the video, but they're important so YouTube doesn't take down my channel. So today, my special shout-out goes to Jamie and Jean. Thank you all for your support. And before we start, answer me something. Does a relationship between a boss and secretary have a chance of working out? Or is it the worst thing that can happen in someone's professional career?" Chapter 1. Dreams and Uncomfortable Reality.
Just work?
Yes, just work. It's all that matters right now.
Monday morning started like every other, with the alarm going off at 7:15, and me already awake for at least 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling of my tiny Brooklyn apartment. I couldn't fall back asleep after the dream had woken me up at 3 in the morning, and now I was lying there, looking at the still ceiling fan, trying not to think about what I'd dreamed, or rather, who I'd dreamed about, again. Alejandro Bentivoglio had been my boss for 2 years, and in the 2 years before that, he'd been the owner of the company where I interned. 4 years total of professional coexistence, and in the last 2, working directly for him as an executive assistant, promoted to special projects manager. 4 years of silent torture, of feeling my heart race every time he walked into the room, of completely losing my train of thought when he got too close explaining some report. I got out of bed and went straight to the shower, letting the cold water wake me up completely and trying to erase the memories of the dream that were still too vivid in my head. It didn't work, because it never worked, but at least it gave me something to do besides lying there thinking about him. I put on the navy blue suit I always wore on Mondays, pulled my hair into a low bun, and applied the minimal makeup I wore to work. Professional, discreet, invisible. Exactly how I like to be. I arrived at the office at 8:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before the official time, because I always arrived early. The Bentivoglio group occupied the top 10 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, and Alejandro's executive office was on the 40th floor, with a panoramic view of the entire city. I worked on the 39th, in a room that was half the size of his conference room, but it was mine, and where I could breathe without feeling that tightness in my chest that I felt every time I was near him. Willow Park was at the reception desk when I walked by, and she looked up from her computer screen with that smile that always put me on alert. We'd started as interns together 4 years ago, and she was the only person in the world who knew exactly what I felt for Alejandro, which was both a blessing and a curse, because Willow had no filter whatsoever. "He got here early," she whispered when I approached her desk, and I felt my stomach tie in a knot. "Been in his office since 8. And Eleanor?" She made a dramatic pause, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "He's wearing that gray suit, the one you said." I covered my ears with my hands before she could finish the sentence. "Willow, don't. Looks like a Renaissance painting." I felt my face heat up instantly, and looked at her with all the indignation I could muster. "I did not say that. You did. Wednesday. Cafeteria, verbatim." She was clearly enjoying my distress, because she crossed her arms and looked at me with that air of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "I was describing color palette, analysis, professional." Willow let out a low laugh that made some people look in our direction, and I glared at her. "Sure. Very professional." She paused, and then her expression changed to something more serious. "And Eleanor? He asked for you as soon as he arrived. Meeting at 9, his office." My heart raced in a way that was completely disproportionate for what was just a normal work meeting. He always requested meetings, always needed reports, always had some new project he wanted to discuss. It was normal. It was work. Nothing unusual. So why was my hand shaking when I took the folder Willow handed me? "Okay, normal, work," I said, more to myself than to her. Willow leaned over the desk, whispering in that conspiratorial tone she loved to use. "Good luck with the analysis of palette." I left before she could say anything else, taking the stairs to the 40th floor, because the elevator was packed, and I needed a few minutes to breathe. When I reached his office door, it was exactly 9 o'clock, and I knocked 3 times before hearing his voice calling me in. "Good morning. You asked for," I started to say, but the sentence died in the air when he turned from the window. Alejandro Bentivoglio was 37 years old, had dark hair he always kept perfectly slicked back, brown eyes so dark they looked black under certain lights, and that kind of presence that made anyone in the room stop breathing for a second. The gray suit he was wearing was impeccable, tailored in a way that probably cost more than my 3 months' rent. And when he spoke, that deep voice with the subtle Italian accent that had never completely gone away hit me like it always did. Eleanor, sit. I sat in the chair across from his desk, placing the folder on my lap and composing my professional expression, the one I'd practiced in the mirror 1,000 times, the one that completely hid the fact that my heart was beating so fast I was sure he could hear it. Ready? I said, and my voice came out steady. At least that. He approached the desk, picking up a folder that was next to the computer and placing it in front of me. But instead of going back to his chair, he stood next to me, close, too close. I could smell his cologne, that damn cologne of wood and leather and something floral that must cost a fortune and that I'd probably recognize anywhere in the world. Milan report. Need complete revision. Presentation Thursday. You see? He spoke looking at the papers, but I was having trouble concentrating on anything other than the fact that he was less than half a meter away. I swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. Of course, Thursday works. I paused, flipping through the papers quickly to make sure I understood the scope of the work. Any specific priority? Section? That's when he looked at me, and I made the mistake of looking back. His eyes were fixed on mine, studying my face in a way that made me forget how to breathe for a full second. Your analysis. Creative. The one you did for Rome? Want the same style? You captured essence, in a way my Italian team couldn't. He paused, tilting his head slightly. How do you do that? I was surprised, because direct compliments from Alejandro were rare. He was generous with professional recognition in general, always thanked people for work well done, but rarely specified like this, rarely talked about something I'd done as if it were special. I research cultural context, local art, history, and weave that into the financial analysis. Makes it more human. He continued studying me for a few more seconds, and I saw something pass through his eyes, something I couldn't identify. Human, he repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes, exactly. Then he stepped away, going to the side table where there was a coffee maker. Coffee. Already had some. Thank you. He poured himself a cup, with his back to me while he stirred in the sugar. You know, it's been 4 years since you started working here. Yes, September marked it. I didn't know where this conversation was going, and that put me on alert. Alejandro turned around, holding the cup with that natural elegance he had in everything he did, and looked at me over the rim. And in that time, I never asked you, are you happy here? The question caught me completely off guard, and I blinked a few times before I could answer. Yes, very. It's the best job I've ever had. Just work? My heart gave an uncomfortable jump in my chest, and I felt a wave of heat rise up my neck. What do you mean? He smiled, and it was that damn smile he did sometimes, just with one corner of his mouth, that made me completely forget where I was. Nothing specific, just checking. He took a sip of coffee, still watching me. You can go. Report, Thursday. I got up from the chair too fast, almost dropping the folder in the process, and left the office without looking back. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall for a second, closing my eyes and trying to control my breathing. What was that? I whispered to myself, but the empty hallway obviously had no answers. The rest of the day passed in a strange fog of work and thoughts I tried to push to the back of my mind. I opened the Milan report as soon as I got to my office, diving into the numbers and market analyses that needed to be reviewed. But every 5 minutes, my mind went back to that conversation, to the way he'd looked at me, to the question about being happy. Just work? What did he mean by that? Was it just a casual question from a boss concerned about employee well-being, or was there something more there? And why had he stood so close when he put the folder on the desk? Why had he stood next to me instead of going back to his chair? I shook my head, trying to focus. I was reading too much into things, like I always did when it came to Alejandro. He was just polite, just a good boss, just someone who cared about the team. There was nothing beyond that, even if my heart insisted on beating faster every time I thought about him. At 3 p.m, Willow appeared at my office door with 2 coffee cups, and that smile that meant she wanted to gossip. She came in without waiting for an invitation, placing one of the cups on my desk and throwing herself into the chair across from me. So, how was the meeting with the Greek god? She asked, and I rolled my eyes. It was a normal work meeting, Willow. He asked for a report revision. Nothing special. And why did you come out of there red as a tomato? I picked up the coffee cup just to have something to do with my hands. I didn't. Eleanor Carson, I've known you for 4 years. You literally ran out of that office and stood leaning against the hallway wall for a good 30 seconds before coming back here. She crossed her legs, settling into the chair as if preparing for a long conversation. What did he say? I sighed, because I knew Willow wouldn't give up until I told her. He asked if I was happy here, At work, she arched an eyebrow. And I said yes, that it's the best job I've ever had. And he asked, just work? The words came out in a whisper, as if saying them out loud was admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Willow was silent for a moment, and then a slow smile spread across her face. Eleanor, he's interested. He's not. The denial was automatic, instinctive, because accepting any other possibility was too terrifying. He is. He's clearly trying to find out if you're available, if there's anything more in your life besides work. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Eleanor, everyone in the office sees the way he looks at you. It's not normal. It's not how he looks at anyone else. I felt my face heat up again and shook my head. You're seeing things that don't exist. I'm seeing the obvious that you refuse to see. Willow took a sip of her coffee, watching me with that expression she used when she thought I was being stubborn. When was the last time you went out with someone, that you tried to meet someone who wasn't him? The question caught me by surprise, and I stared at the cup in my hands without answering. When had been the last time? I'd gone on a few casual dates over the years, dinners that had never gone beyond the first night, because I always compared everyone to him, always found something was missing, always felt like I was wasting time. Exactly, Willow said, as if my silence was answer enough. Eleanor, you need to decide what you're going to do. Keep going like this, dreaming about him every night and running away every time he gets close, or do something about it. Do what? Walk up and say, "Hi, Alejandro. I have feelings for you and I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about you." I let out a humorless laugh. That would work out great. Maybe it would, she shrugged. Or you could at least stop running from him. Let things flow naturally. See what happens. See what happens. As if it were that simple. As if I didn't have 1,000 reasons to keep my distance, to not let anything happen. Alejandro was my boss, was part of an Italian Mafia family, was someone who'd probably dated models and artists and sophisticated women from all over the world. And I was just Eleanor Carson, the girl from rural Oklahoma who'd worked hard to get where she was, who had never really given herself to anyone, because she'd never found someone who deserved it, and now was completely in love with someone absolutely unattainable. I need to finish this report, I said, signaling the end of the conversation, and Willow sighed but stood up. Okay, but Eleanor, think about what I said. She stopped at the door, looking back. Life's too short for you to spend it running from what you feel. After she left, I sat staring at the computer screen without really seeing anything. Think about what I said. As if I did anything else besides think. As if Alejandro Bentivoglio didn't completely dominate my every thought, awake or asleep. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to focus. I had a report to revise, a presentation to prepare, work to do. I couldn't just sit here thinking about impossible things, about feelings that led nowhere. But when I opened my eyes and went back to the numbers on the screen, the only thing I could see was his smile, that corner of the mouth smile that made me forget how to breathe. And the question that kept echoing in my head, just work? I have a feeling Eleanor is going to dream about that question. Chapter 2, Dream, Dinner, and First Moment.
You're enchanting.
The weeks following that strange meeting were a form of torture I didn't know existed. Alejandro had always been present in the office, had always been the type of boss who followed projects closely, but now it seemed like he was everywhere at once. Explaining some report detail with his hand resting on the back of my chair, leaning over my shoulder to point at something on the computer screen, touching my arm in passing when we crossed paths in the hallway. Casual touches, professional, completely innocent. That killed me a little inside every time. Willow had started keeping a mental count of how many times a day I turned red, and had already concluded that my record was 13 times in a single day. 13 moments when Alejandro had gotten too close, had spoken too softly near my ear, had looked at me in a way that made my brain shut down completely. I was dying, slowly, painfully, professionally, and the worst part was that I couldn't stop dreaming about him. Every night, without exception, my subconscious decided to torture me with impossible scenarios that made me wake up with my heart racing and completely embarrassed with myself. That Thursday night, the dream was particularly cruel. The office was empty, silent, and I was alone in my room when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I knew they were his before I even saw him, because I'd recognized that sound anywhere, that confident and controlled way of walking that was uniquely his. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing the suit he'd worn during the day, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves slightly rolled up. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice came out deep, loaded with something I couldn't name but that made my stomach tie in a knot. I stood up from my chair without really knowing why, and he approached slowly, each step measured and deliberate. When he stopped in front of me, he was so close I could feel the heat from him, the cologne that always made me dizzy, and when he raised his hand and touched my face with that gentleness that contrasted completely with the intensity in his eyes, I forgot how to breathe. "I need to tell you something," he whispered, leaning closer, and I closed my eyes because I couldn't look at him anymore without feeling like I was going to fall apart. I felt his breath brush my lips, felt his fingers slide from my face to the nape of my neck, and then the alarm went off. I woke up with a start, knocking the pillow onto the floor and almost falling out of bed in the process. My heart was racing, my face was on fire, and I was sweating in a way that was completely disproportionate to the fact that it was a cold October morning and the heater wasn't even on. No, 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 I groaned, throwing the other pillow over my face and letting out a muffled scream of frustration. Stop dreaming about your boss! My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I grabbed it with one hand, still with the pillow covering my face with the other. It was a message from Willow, sent at 7 in the morning, which meant she'd gotten to the office before me for the first time in history. Willow says, Alejandro asked for you for a business dinner tonight. Italian client. He wants you with him. Cultural translation. Dinner. I pulled the pillow off my face and looked at the phone screen as if she'd just handed me a death sentence. Dinner. With Alejandro and a client. Cultural translation, which meant he wanted me to stay the entire evening beside him, talking, interacting, probably sitting too close at a fancy restaurant table. I typed a response, trying to stay calm. It's a business dinner. Her response came in 2 seconds. With the I wanna eat you for dinner eyes he makes at you. Sure, honey. I responded, he doesn't do that. She responds, whole team saw it. Monday meeting, you explaining the project, him looking at you like a work of art. Ciao, Bella. I threw the phone on the bed and went to take a shower, letting the cold water wake me up and hopefully bring me back to reality. It didn't work, because throughout the entire shower, throughout the entire time it took me to get ready and choose the navy blue dress that was formal, but not flashy, all I could think about was the dinner, and how I was going to survive an entire evening beside him without doing something completely embarrassing. The restaurant was Italian, obviously, a fancy place in Midtown with classic decor, low lights, and tables with impeccable white tablecloths. I arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time because I always arrived early for everything, and found Alejandro already waiting at the bar, talking in Italian with what seemed to be the restaurant owner. When he saw me, he said goodbye to the man, and came in my direction, and I had to make a conscious effort to keep breathing normally. The suit was black this time, with a white shirt that contrasted perfectly with his lightly tanned skin, and when he smiled as he approached, I felt my knees weaken. Eleanor, punctual as always, he said, and his voice had that warm tone he used sometimes, which made me feel like I was special somehow. You know me. Being late gives me anxiety, I replied, trying to sound casual and probably failing miserably. He laughed softly, a deep sound that reverberated in my chest, and gestured to the reserved table in the corner of the restaurant. Marco is on his way. Should be here in 5 minutes. He paused, looking at me in a way that made my face heat up. You look beautiful, by the way. Blue suits you. Thanking him would be admitting that the compliment had affected me, so I just smiled and mumbled something about having chosen the outfit in a hurry before sitting in the chair he pulled out for me. He sat beside me instead of across from me, and I tried not to think about the fact that this meant we'd spend the entire evening inches apart. Marco Fiore arrived exactly on time, an Italian man in his 60s with gray hair and a warm smile that lit up his entire face when he greeted Alejandro. They talked in Italian for a few minutes, too fast for me to follow completely, and then Alejandro turned to me. Marco, this is Eleanor Carson, my special projects manager. The way he said my did something strange to my stomach. Eleanor. Marco Fiore. He's considering investing in the Milan project. I greeted Marco in Italian, thanking him for coming and saying it was a pleasure to meet him, and saw his eyes widen in surprise. Madonna! You speak Italian, he exclaimed, and then looked at Alejandro with an amused expression. Where did you find her, Alejandro? She's perfect. The dinner went surprisingly smoothly after that. Marco was charming, and talked non-stop about his family, his business, and his memories of Bologna. I translated cultural context when necessary, explained historical references that came up in the conversation, and at some point started talking about medieval Italian history and art patrons of the Renaissance period. Signorina Carson, where did Alejandro find you? Marco asked again, this time laughing. You know Bologna better than I do. I felt my face heat up, but smiled. I read a lot, and medieval Italian art has always fascinated me, especially the patrons, the way they shaped an entire cultural era through patronage. I looked at Alejandro without meaning to, and he was watching me with an intensity that made my heart skip. It's a fascinating history. Marco raised his wine glass, toasting us to fascinating history, and the women who study it. He took a sip, and then his phone rang. Mi dispiace. I need to answer. It's my daughter. One moment. He got up and headed toward the bar, leaving Alejandro and me alone for the first time all evening. The silence that followed was different, loaded with something I couldn't name but that made the air feel heavier, hotter. Alejandro turned in his chair to face me, resting his elbow on the table and watching me with that expression I couldn't decipher. You studied my family, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement, almost a whisper. Bentivoglio, the patrons of Bologna. I felt my face catch fire. and looked away at the wine glass in front of me. It's context research. Professional. Eleanor. The way he said my name made me look back at him, and what I saw in his eyes left me breathless. Yes, I studied it, I finally admitted. Your family is fascinating. 400 years of history, art, politics, cultural influence. I paused, biting my lip. Sorry. It's invasive. Alejandro leaned closer, and suddenly we were so close. I could see the small golden flecks in his brown eyes, could feel his breath, could count the beats of my own heart. It's not invasive, he said, and his voice came out low, almost hoarse. It's enchanting. You're the first person in years who's been interested in the history, not the money, not the power, the history. He paused, and I saw something vulnerable pass across his face. Tell me what you know. And then, I did something completely unexpected. I completely forgot about the shyness, the embarrassment, the fear of talking too much. I told him about the Bentivoglios of Bologna, about how the family had been patrons of the arts in the 15th century, about the works they'd financed, the artists they'd supported, the cultural influence they'd exerted. I talked about architecture, about politics, about how the family had navigated centuries of change while maintaining their relevance and power. And Alejandro listened to me, not just listened, but observed every word, every gesture, every moment of passion that showed in my voice when I talked about something I loved. I saw something change in his eyes, something soft I'd never seen before, and when Marco returned to the table, Alejandro kept looking at me for a few more seconds, before turning his attention away. Marco looked from one to the other, with a discreet smile that suggested he'd noticed something, but didn't comment, just went back to talking about the Milan project. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange fog of business conversations and stolen moments, where I'd catch Alejandro watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. When we finally left the restaurant, Marco said goodbye with warm hugs and the promise that he'd invest in the project, and then left in his taxi, leaving us alone on the sidewalk. Come, my driver is waiting, Alejandro said, gesturing to the black car parked on the corner. The ride back was silent, but it was a different silence from what normally existed between us. It was comfortable, almost intimate, as if we didn't need to fill the space with words. I looked out the window, watching the lights of New York pass by, and felt his presence beside me like something almost tangible. Eleanor, he said suddenly, and his voice broke the silence in a soft way. Thank you, for tonight. I looked at him, confused. It's my job. It wasn't work, he replied, and there was something in his voice that made my heart race. It was a gift. You gave me something I haven't had in a long time. He paused, searching for words. Connection, with my history, with who I am beyond what I do. I felt tears threaten my eyes, and I had to swallow before I could speak. You're welcome. Alejandro. His name came out of my mouth without the Mr. I always used, without the formality I maintained as a shield. It was the first time in 2 years I'd called him just by his name, and I saw the exact moment he noticed. His eyes widened slightly. Something passed across his face, and then he smiled, small but genuine. Good night, Eleanor, he said, when the car stopped in front of my building. I got out of the car in some kind of trance, and only when I was alone in the elevator going up to my apartment did I allow the realization to hit me completely. I have a serious problem, I murmured to my reflection in the metal elevator doors, because it wasn't just attraction anymore. It wasn't just dreams and racing heartbeats anymore. I was completely, hopelessly in love with Alejandro Bentivoglio, and I had no idea what to do about it. Well, at least she admitted quickly that she's in love. Chapter 3. Growing Intimacy and Constant Escape.
Why do you run?
I don't run. I adapt.
The months following that dinner with Marco Fiore were the most confusing of my life, and I'd already been through a lot of confusion over my 25 years. The difference was that this time, the confusion had a name, a face, and a voice that haunted me even when I was alone in my apartment at 11 at night, trying to watch some random series on Netflix. Alejandro had changed. Or maybe I had changed the way I saw things. But either way, something was definitely different. He sought me out for everything now. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything. Meetings that had nothing to do with my projects, working lunches that extended for 3 hours, and inevitably drifted from financial reports to discussions about Renaissance art and Italian philosophy, document reviews that turned into conversations about life, family, history. It was torturous. Deliciously, agonizingly torturous. Because with each conversation, each moment we spent together, I felt like I was getting to know a different Alejandro, from the distant professional boss of the first years. He talked about the mother he'd lost early, about how he'd learned to play piano with her, about the afternoons in Bologna when he was a child running through the gardens of the family estate. He told stories about the mistakes he'd made when he took over the business, about the hard lessons he'd learned, about how sometimes he missed the simplicity of just being Alejandro instead of Don Bentivoglio. And I listened to everything, absorbing every word as if it were the most precious thing in the world, storing every detail in my memory to revisit later when when I was alone and could process the fact that he was letting me in a way he apparently didn't let anyone else. But whenever things got too intimate, whenever I felt we were crossing some invisible line between professional and personal, I ran. I made up excuses, remembered non-existent commitments, claimed tight deadlines that needed my immediate attention, and he never insisted, just watched me with that expression I couldn't decipher, something between understanding and frustration, before letting me go. It was a destructive pattern, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. That Thursday, at the end of November, I was in my office reviewing the budget for the West Coast expansion project when I heard the familiar knock on the door. 3 knocks, firm and confident, that immediately made my heart race even before I looked up and saw Alejandro standing in the doorway. "Got a minute?" he asked, and I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He came in but didn't sit, standing with his hands in the pockets of his dark gray suit pants. That damn suit that reminded me of the first day Willow had teased me about the Renaissance painting comparison, and that still left me speechless every time I saw him wearing it. "I'm going to Milan on Friday," he said. Straight to the point. "Presentation for the Farini family. They want to invest in the European expansion, and I want you to come." My first instinct was professional, automatic. "Of course, I'll prepare the presentation materials, the projection reports, and—" "Eleanor," he interrupted me, and there was something in his tone that made me stop talking. "It's not just materials. I want you there, in person, at the presentation." He paused, and I saw something pass through his eyes. "And after the presentation, there's a dinner in Milan, and I want to show you the city you've studied so much. See with your own eyes everything you've read in books." I felt my heart explode in my chest, that familiar feeling of panic mixed with something like hope, and immediately my defenses went up. That's beyond the scope." Alejandro frowned, tilting his head slightly. "Scope?" "Of work," I finished, and the words came out weak even to my own ears. Tourist dinner isn't exactly part of my responsibilities as project manager. I saw the exact moment frustration replaced confusion on his face. He took a step closer to the desk, leaning slightly forward, and when he spoke, his voice came out low but loaded with something intense. "You run. You realize that?" My stomach tied in a knot. "I don't run." "Yes, you do." He didn't take his eyes off me, and I felt like he was seeing right through all my defenses, all the excuses I'd built over the months. "Every time we get close, every time things get personal, you pull back, make up an excuse, disappear." He paused, and I heard the frustration clear in his voice. "Why?" "Because I love you," my heart screamed. "Because I have a secret you don't know. Because you're you and I'm me. Because I'm afraid you'll discover I'm completely inadequate to be by your side in any way other than professionally." But obviously, I couldn't say any of that. "It's nothing personal," I murmured, looking away at the papers on my desk. "It's just professionalism, maintaining appropriate boundaries between boss and employee." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I forced myself to look back at him and saw that Alejandro was watching me with that intensity that always left me breathless, as if trying to decipher a particularly complex puzzle. After long seconds, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he finally said, and his voice came out controlled, emotionless. "Milan. Just the presentation then. Professional." He turned, going back to the desk, and picked up the folder that was next to the laptop. "Here are the details. Flight leaves Friday at 7 in the morning. Clara will make the hotel reservations." He didn't look at me when he said this, already turning his attention to some document he'd picked up, and I understood the clear message. Subject closed, boundary established. I got up from my chair, holding the folder against my chest as if it were some kind of shield. "Understood. I'll prepare." I left his office with legs that didn't seem to want to obey me properly, and when I reached the hallway, I leaned against the cold wall and closed my eyes, trying to control my breathing that was coming out irregular. "You're an idiot, Eleanor Carson," I thought to myself. "He was inviting you to something personal, something special, and you threw in his face that it was just professionalism." But what else could I have said? That yes, I wanted to go to Milan with him, wanted to see the city through his eyes, wanted to spend an entire evening talking about art and history without worrying about reports and presentations. That just thinking about being alone with him in a romantic restaurant in Milan made my heart beat so fast I was afraid I'd faint, that I was so afraid of what I felt for him that running seemed like the only safe option. I went back to my office on some kind of autopilot, finished the day's work without really remembering anything I'd done, and when I finally left the office at 7 at night, I found Willow waiting for me in the lobby. "Apartment. Now." "I ordered Thai food and bought wine," she announced, leaving no room for discussion. 20 minutes later, we were sitting on the floor of my tiny living room, surrounded by boxes of pad thai and spring rolls, and Willow was looking at me with that expression that meant she wasn't going to let me out of this conversation. "You ran away again?" she asked as soon as I finished telling her about Alejandro's invitation. "What was I supposed to do?" I shot back, grabbing another spring roll just to have something to do with my hands. "Go to Milan, accept the dinner, and then he'd get too close and I gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. "And you?" "What?" Willow leaned forward, her eyes fixed on me. Eleanor, talk. What paralyzes you so much? I was silent for a long moment, looking at the wine in my glass, seeing my distorted reflection in the red liquid. I'd never told anyone, never admitted it out loud, but if there was anyone in the world who would understand without judging, it was Willow. Willow, I started, and had to stop because the words were stuck in my throat. Never what? I took a deep breath, feeling my face catch fire. Been with anyone. The words came out in a whisper, and I saw Willow frown slightly, confused. I've never slept with anyone, Willow. Never done anything. I'm pure, completely. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of traffic outside. Willow looked at me for long seconds, and then her expression softened. Okay, she finally said. That's ridiculous. At 25, I know. I covered my face with my hands, mortified at having admitted it out loud. I wasn't going to say that. Willow pulled my hands away from my face, forcing me to look at her. I was going to say, it makes sense. Why you run? Alejandro is a lot. Intense. Experienced. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And you feel like that he'll notice, I finished for her, and felt tears threaten my eyes. That I'm inexperienced, naive, that I don't know anything about this, and he'll laugh. Or worse, he'll reject me because he doesn't want to deal with someone so backward. Willow pulled me into a tight hug, and I let some tears fall, wetting the shoulder of her blouse. He won't, she murmured. Eleanor, if there's one thing I've learned watching you two over the last few months, it's that man looks at you like you're the most precious thing he's ever seen. He won't laugh. He won't reject. She pulled back, holding my face between her hands. But Eleanor, you need to decide. Keep running. Keep protecting yourself. Keep living in fear. Or take a risk. Trust. Let something happen. I wiped the tears with the back of my hand, smiling humorlessly. I don't know. And that was the most honest truth I had. I didn't know what to do. Didn't know how to stop running. Didn't know how to be brave enough to accept what Alejandro was offering. All I knew was that the fear of losing him was starting to be greater than the fear of giving myself to him. But it still wasn't big enough to make me stop running. Chapter 4. Alejandro loses it.
Tell me what scares you.
Right now, being stuck in this elevator?
I'm serious.
And elevator. Alejandro Bentivoglio had 37 years of experience controlling his emotions, maintaining the impenetrable mask that a Don needed to have, completely separating personal feelings from professional decisions. It was a skill he'd developed since childhood, when he'd seen his father lose everything by being emotionally vulnerable, and that he'd perfected over the decades building an empire that demanded coldness and rationality above all else. And in the last 3 months, Eleanor Carson had completely destroyed that ability. He was sitting in his office on a December morning, looking at the financial report on the computer screen without really seeing anything, because all he could think about was her, the way she'd refused the invitation to Milan, the expression on her face when she'd said that thing about professionalism, the way she'd left his office like she was running from something dangerous. She was running. From him. And he couldn't understand why. He'd spent weeks trying to get closer, trying to show that his interest went beyond professional, trying to create moments where they could really get to know each other without the barrier of corporate hierarchies. And every damn time, Eleanor pulled back, made up excuses, claimed commitments, disappeared behind that polite, professional mask she wore like armor, and it was driving him completely insane. The office door opened without warning, and Luca Ferrante entered with the confidence of someone who had permission to ignore protocol. He was Alejandro's closest capo, his right-hand man for almost a decade, and one of the few people in the world who could read Alejandro like an open book. "Boss," Luca said, throwing himself into the chair across from the desk without ceremony. "You're distracted." Alejandro looked away from the screen, shooting a warning look at Luca. "Work." Eleanor. Her name came out as a statement, not a question, and Alejandro felt irritation grow in his chest. "Work," he repeated, this time with more emphasis, and saw Luca smile discreetly. "Sure, work." Luca crossed his legs, clearly enjoying himself. "That's why you've been looking at the same page of the report for 20 minutes without moving the mouse. Intense work." Alejandro glared at him, but didn't respond, because he knew anything he said would be used against him. Luca was right. Obviously, he was distracted, was obsessed, was completely unable to concentrate on anything other than Eleanor and the impossible enigma she represented. Luca stood up, still smiling, and went to the door. "Just came to let you know the meeting with the Farinis has been rescheduled for next week. They want to come here, instead of Milan." He paused at the door, looking back. "And, boss, maybe you should just ask her, directly, why she runs instead of sitting here brooding. The door closed before Alejandro could respond, and he was alone again, staring at the empty space and considering Luca's words. Ask directly, as if it were that simple. In the 3 days that followed, Alejandro began to notice a pattern that irritated him even more. Eleanor was actively and deliberately avoiding face-to-face contact. She sent emails when she would normally come personally to his office, left for lunch 15 minutes early, and returned 15 minutes after normal time, left reports on his desk when he was in meetings. It was like she'd created an entire system to minimize any chance of them being alone. And on Wednesday afternoon, Alejandro decided that was enough. He left the office in the middle of an international call, ignoring Clara's surprised look as he passed the reception desk, and took the stairs down to the 39th floor. Eleanor's office was at the end of the hallway, a small room but with a view of the city, and when he reached the door, he saw she was alone, typing something on the computer with that intense concentration she always had when working. He knocked once on the door and entered without waiting for a response. Eleanor jumped up from her chair, eyes wide with surprise when she saw him standing in the doorway. Alejandro, I was going to. Why are you avoiding me? He got straight to the point, closing the door behind him. He saw the color drain from her face, quickly replaced by an intense blush. I'm not. Yes, you are. He took a step into the room, keeping his voice controlled, even though frustration was growing by the second. 3 days. No face-to-face contact. Short, objective emails. You disappear at lunchtime. He paused, studying her face. What did I do? Nothing. It's work. I was busy with. Eleanor gestured vaguely at the computer, trying to maintain professional composure, but he saw the panic in her eyes. Alejandro moved closer, walking around the desk until he was beside her, close enough to smell the soft perfume she wore, close enough to see her breathing accelerate. When he spoke, he kept his voice low, controlled, but let all the intensity he was feeling leak into the words. Eleanor, you come into my life, make me feel things I haven't felt in years. He saw her eyes widen, saw the exact moment she stopped breathing, and then you disappear, and come back, and disappear again. And I don't. He forced himself to stop, to control his tone before saying something he couldn't take back. I need to understand. Eleanor looked at him with that expression of vulnerability mixed with terror that he'd seen a few times before, and opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment his phone rang. Alejandro cursed mentally, picking up the phone and seeing Clara's name on the screen. Meeting. He'd completely forgotten. He looked back at Eleanor, seeing how she'd stepped back half a step, how her hands were clenched in fists at her sides, and made a decision. Come, he said, putting away his phone. Elevator. Now. We're finishing this conversation. He didn't leave room for discussion, leaving the office and hearing her footsteps behind him in the hallway. The elevator was empty when they arrived, and Alejandro entered, holding the door until Eleanor also entered, clearly reluctant. The doors closed, and the elevator began to rise from the 39th to the 40th floor. The silence was suffocating, heavy with everything that wasn't being said. Alejandro looked at Eleanor, seeing how she was staring fixedly at the numbers above the door, as if she were praying for the elevator to move faster. Talk, he said, breaking the silence. Why do you run? Eleanor didn't look at him. I don't run. I just. Eleanor. The way he said her name made her finally turn, and when their eyes met, Alejandro felt as if the air had been sucked out of the small space. She looked at him with that mixture of fear and something else, something intense he couldn't name, and he saw the exact moment her defenses began to crack. 30th floor, 28, 25. The tension grew with each passing number. Alejandro took a step closer, reducing the distance between them until he was close enough to touch, but without doing so. When he spoke, his voice came out soft, almost a whisper. Tell me, what scares you about me? And then the dams broke. It's not you, it's me. Eleanor closed her eyes, and he saw her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage, and then the words began to come out in a desperate flood. I've never been with anyone, Alejandro. Never. I'm pure, completely, and you're you. And I keep imagining and running because I'm embarrassed that I don't even know how things work. And you've probably dated models and artists and women who know what they're doing. And I'm just a girl from rural Oklahoma who dreams about her boss every night and wakes up completely red. And she stopped abruptly, covering her mouth with her hand, eyes wide with horror at what she'd just admitted. The elevator reached the 40th floor. The doors opened. Eleanor stood still, eyes closed, clearly expecting some kind of rejection, some cruel word, something that would confirm all the fears she'd just exposed. Alejandro looked at her, at this woman who had just completely opened up, handed over her deepest vulnerability into his hands, and felt something fundamentally shift inside his chest. The world stopped. Everything stopped. And suddenly, everything made sense. The constant running, the resistance, the fear in her eyes every time he got too close. She wasn't running because she didn't feel anything. She was running because she felt too much, and was afraid of not being enough. Before the doors could close on their own, Alejandro pressed the button, making the elevator start descending again. Eleanor opened her eyes, confused, looking around as if trying to understand what was happening. "What?" she started, but didn't finish because Alejandro stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. It was gentle, careful, but firm. Strong arms around her, holding her as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. He didn't say anything, because there were no words for what he was feeling, for the wave of emotions that had hit him when she'd confessed everything. Eleanor froze for a moment, completely immobile in his arms, and then he felt the moment she crumbled. Her body relaxed against his, her hands clutched at the back of his suit, and then she started to cry. Not dramatic sobs, but silent tears that wet his shoulder, soft tremors he felt through the embrace. Alejandro just held her, one hand rising to stroke her hair, the other firm on her back, keeping her close. "Thank you," he murmured softly in her ear, his voice coming out hoarse, "for telling me." The elevator went down and up, ignored, while they stood there embracing in the small space, and Alejandro felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope, and an absolute certainty that he wasn't going to let Eleanor go. Chapter 5. Cancelled meetings and their afternoon.
I'd cancel a war.
When the elevator doors finally opened again in the lobby, I was still trying to process the fact that I'd just confessed everything to Alejandro Bentivoglio. Everything. Every pathetic secret, every embarrassing fear, every thought I'd kept for months. And instead of laughing, instead of rejecting me, instead of doing any of the 1,000 terrible things I'd imagined, he'd hugged me. I felt his hand on my shoulder, firm and comforting, guiding me out of the elevator, even though my legs didn't seem to want to cooperate properly. My eyes were still swollen from crying so much, my face probably red and blotchy, and the only thing I wanted was to disappear into a hole and never come out. Alejandro took his phone from his pocket, dialing a number while keeping me close to him with his other hand. When Clara answered, I heard her efficient voice on the other side, probably already starting to list the day's appointments. "Clara, cancel everything. Today," he said, his voice coming out with that natural authority that left no room for discussion. There was a pause, and then he added, "Tomorrow too, if necessary." He hung up, without waiting for a response. I looked at him, confused and still kind of dazed from everything that had happened. "You canceled?" "Yes, but you had the meeting with canceled, and the Milan client who was going to canceled." He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that made my heart give a strange jump in my chest. "Eleanor, stop." His voice softened, becoming almost gentle. "Some days have meetings. Today has you." I felt like the floor had disappeared from under my feet. He'd canceled everything. For me. Because I'd had an emotional breakdown in the elevator and revealed all my most pathetic secrets. And instead of sending me home with a polite pat on the back, he was staying with me. "You didn't have to," I started, but he interrupted me with a look. "Eleanor," he stopped walking, turning to face me completely. "You revealed something difficult, something you've been carrying for a while, and you were afraid of rejection." He paused, and I saw something intense pass across his face. I'd cancel a war for that. A meeting is easy. I couldn't respond, because the words had gotten stuck in my throat along with more tears that threatened to fall. He gestured to the private elevator in the corner of the lobby, the one only he used, and guided me in that direction. "Come," he said, pressing the button that called the elevator. "My apartment is on the 42nd floor. It's private. We can talk without interruptions." The apartment. His. Private. My brain was having trouble processing this information, but I followed him into the elevator anyway, because apparently I'd stopped having control over my own decisions at some point in the last half hour. When the doors opened directly into what could only be described as a spectacular penthouse, I stopped at the entrance and just looked around with my mouth slightly open. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of New York, dark, gleaming hardwood floors, bookshelves full of books that went to the ceiling, artwork on the walls that I recognized as originals even from a distance, and in the center of the room, impossible to ignore, a black grand piano that gleamed under the natural light coming through the windows. "You live here?" I asked, still standing at the entrance like an idiot. Alejandro went to the kitchen, which was all white marble and stainless steel appliances that probably cost more than my car. "When I'm in New York, I have properties in Bologna and Milan, too." He turned, resting his hands on the counter. "Tea? Coffee?" My eyes had already returned to the piano, drawn like a magnet. It was beautiful, perfect, the kind of instrument you saw in concert halls and never in normal people's homes, even though Alejandro was far from a normal person. "You play?" I asked, slowly approaching the instrument. Since I was 7, there was something in his voice that made me look back, and I saw a soft expression on his face, something like nostalgia. "My mother taught me. She played every day, on this piano. It was hers before it was mine." He paused, and something like pain passed quickly through his eyes before disappearing. "And you? Do you play?" I shook my head, running my fingers lightly over the polished surface of the piano without actually touching the keys. Not piano, but my grandfather played violin. I'd sit next to him and spend hours listening. He said music was the language that didn't need translation. When I looked back at Alejandro, I saw he was watching me with that intensity that always left me speechless. But this time there was something more there, something vulnerable I'd never seen before. My mother said the same thing, he murmured, and then turned quickly back to the kitchen, as if he needed to do something with his hands. Tea then, please. A few minutes later, we were sitting on the couch facing the windows, each with a cup of tea in our hands, and a strange silence had settled between us. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was loaded with everything that had happened in the elevator, with all the words I'd said and could no longer take back. Alejandro was the first to break the silence, placing his cup on the coffee table and turning slightly to face me. Can I ask something? I felt my entire body tense. Depends. Why never? He raised a hand when he saw my expression. It's not criticism. I just want to understand you. I took a deep breath, looking at the tea in my cup as if it could give me the answers. How to explain something I didn't always fully understand myself. I never found anyone who deserved it, I finally said, and the words came out more honest than I intended. I looked at him, feeling my face heat up. Does that sound weird? No. The answer was immediate, firm. It sounds rare and admirable. I let out a humorless laugh. You don't think it's backward? Being 25 and never having... I think you have your own sense of worth, and you refuse to compromise. Alejandro interrupted me, and there was something so serious in his eyes that made me stop breathing for a second. That's strength, not being backward. The tears came back, but this time they were different. They weren't from shame or fear, but from something warm and comforting that spread through my chest. Thank you, I whispered. Alejandro was silent for a moment, just watching me in a way that made it seem like he was memorizing every detail of my face. Then he leaned slightly forward, his voice coming out low and loaded with something intense. And Eleanor, you said you dream about me. I felt my face explode in flames instantly. I meant I dream about you too. The world stopped. I looked at him, trying to process the words I'd just heard, trying to understand if I'd heard right or if my brain was making things up. Really? Since that dinner, with Fiore, he kept his eyes fixed on mine, without looking away. You talking about Bologna, about my family, about history, with your eyes lit up and your voice all animated because you were talking about something you love. He paused, and I saw something vulnerable cross his face. I thought I'd never wanted so much to just listen to someone talk, never felt so much peace just being near someone. My heart was beating so fast I was sure he could hear it. Alejandro, you date models, artists, women from all over the world, women who know what they're doing, who are sophisticated and experienced. He moved closer, raising a hand and touching my face with a gentleness that contrasted completely with the intensity in his eyes. The woman who makes me feel things I forgot existed, he said, his voice coming out almost in a whisper. Hope, peace, the desire to be just Alejandro instead of Don Bentivoglio. His fingers traced a soft line from my cheek to my chin. That's worth more than all the rest. More than experience, more than sophistication. It's real, and it's rare. I don't know who moved first, whether it was me leaning toward him or him moving closer to me, but suddenly the distance between us had completely disappeared. I felt his breath brush my lips, saw his eyes darken slightly, and then he paused, waiting, asking, giving me the choice. I closed my eyes and closed the final distance. The kiss was soft, gentle, almost hesitant, soft lips pressing against mine with a gentleness that made tears threaten my eyes again. It wasn't like in the dreams. It wasn't intense or consuming. It was better because it was real, because it was his hands actually touching my face, because it was his breath mixing with mine, because it was him choosing to go slow, choosing to be careful with me. I responded timidly, not really knowing what I was doing but trusting my instinct, and I felt him smile slightly against my lips before pulling away. He rested his forehead against mine, keeping his eyes closed, and when he spoke, his voice came out hoarse and low. We'll always go at your pace. I opened my eyes and found his already watching me, dark and intense, but also soft in a way I'd never seen. Okay, I whispered, and it felt like I'd just made a promise that I'd try to stop running. Will she be able to keep that promise? Chapter 6, Getting to Know Each Other, and Maggie appears.
Something feels wrong.
The months following that afternoon in Alejandro's penthouse were the happiest of my life, and I knew it even while I was living it, even without the perspective that only time brings. It was as if the world had changed color after that kiss, after I'd finally stopped running and let things happen naturally. Alejandro kept the promise he'd made, slowly, at my pace, without rushing. He took me to dinners at small, cozy restaurants where we talked for hours about everything and nothing, about books we'd read and movies we wanted to see, about childhood and dreams and fears we'd never admitted to anyone. We spent afternoons in museums, him explaining details about Renaissance paintings that I'd only read about in books, pointing out techniques and stories that brought the works to life in a completely new way. And on Friday nights, when the office was empty and silent, he played piano for me. I'd sit on the couch in his penthouse, with a glass of wine and a book in my hands that usually ended up forgotten, and just listen. Chopin, Debussy, sometimes Italian pieces he'd learned from his mother, and that carried memories of a life he rarely shared with anyone. And when he finished, I'd read to him out loud, excerpts of Italian poetry or passages from art history books, and I'd see how he'd close his eyes and just listen, as if my voice were the most comforting thing in the world. The intimacy grew slowly, built in layers of trust and shared moments without pressure, without expectations beyond being together. He kissed me sometimes. Soft and gentle kisses that never went beyond what I was ready to give, always stopping before I could feel fear or hesitation. And I, who had spent months running, discovered I was becoming more and more confident, less and less scared of the intensity of what I felt. Willow said I was different, lighter, that I smiled more and had stopped turning red every time someone mentioned Alejandro's name. She was right, obviously. I was different because for the first time in my life, I was letting someone really know me, without masks, without defenses, without fear of not being enough. And Alejandro knew me. He knew the way I bit my lip when I was nervous, how I always ordered tea instead of coffee after 6 in the evening, how my eyes lit up when I talked about medieval Italian history. He knew my fears and my insecurities, and still stayed, still chose to be with me. It was scary and wonderful at the same time. In March, Alejandro sponsored a contemporary Italian art exhibition at a gallery in Chelsea, and invited me to accompany him to the official opening. It wasn't the first time we'd appeared together at public events, but it was the first time I was officially by his side, not as an employee, but as whatever we were. Girlfriend seemed too simple a word for what we had, but it was the closest thing. I arrived at the gallery wearing a simple black dress that Willow had helped me choose, and found Alejandro waiting at the entrance, talking to the curator in Italian. When he saw me, he politely said goodbye and came in my direction, and the way his eyes lit up when he saw me made my heart give that familiar jump in my chest. "You look beautiful," he said softly, kissing my cheek in a way that was casual but intimate at the same time. "Thank you," I murmured, feeling my face heat up slightly even after months together. The gallery was packed with elegant people, all holding champagne glasses, and talking in small groups while observing the exhibited works. Alejandro guided me through the crowd with his hand on my back, introducing me to artists and collectors, and I felt strangely comfortable in that world that should have been completely alien to a girl from rural Oklahoma. We were standing in front of a particularly interesting installation, Alejandro explaining the historical context of the piece, when I heard a familiar voice shout my name. "Eleanor!" I turned and saw Maggie Carson running in my direction with a huge smile on her face, her arms already open for a hug. My cousin was 2 years older than me, extroverted where I was reserved, confident where I was shy, and we'd grown up together in Oklahoma before I moved to New York. We hadn't talked much since then, just some occasional messages and birthday calls, so seeing her there was a complete surprise. "What a surprise!" she exclaimed, hugging me with excessive force before pulling back and looking at Alejandro with wide eyes. "And you must be Alejandro Bentivoglio." She extended her hand in a way that seemed too suggestive to be just polite. "Maggie Carson, Eleanor's cousin. It's an honor to meet you." Alejandro shook her hand with the formal courtesy he used with people he didn't know well. "Maggie, pleasure. Eleanor always talked about you," Maggie continued, her voice a tone higher than necessary for the environment. "My incredible boss," she'd say. "How proud to be here. Your space is beautiful. And you're even more impressive in person." I felt a strange discomfort grow in my chest as I watched Maggie talk non-stop. The exaggerated gestures, the way she looked at Alejandro with an intensity that made me frown slightly. She was being too much, too animated, too interested, too everything. Alejandro maintained a polite but distant expression, clearly not as charmed as Maggie expected him to be. "Thank you," he said, and then turned to me. "Eleanor? Give me a minute. Marco wants to talk about the installation on the second floor." I nodded, and he left in the direction of a group of men near the stairs, leaving me alone with Maggie for the first time in years. Her smile changed instantly, becoming sharper, more interested. "Eleanor, you and him!" I felt my face heat up, not really knowing how to explain something I was still trying to fully understand myself. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Maggie moved closer, lowering her voice but maintaining that strange intensity. "Are you together? Like, officially?" "We're seeing where things go," I replied, choosing my words carefully. Maggie looked at me for a long moment, and then her eyes narrowed slightly. Eleanor, I've heard of the Bentivoglio family." She made a significant pause, as if expecting me to understand something. "You know who he is? What he does?" I felt a pang of irritation grow in my chest. "I know. And you're okay with that?" She looked in the direction where Alejandro was, talking to Marco and other men, and there was something on her face I couldn't identify. "With everything that comes with it?" "Maggie, I didn't come here to discuss my personal life," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. No, of course." She raised her hands, smiling again, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I just worry about you, cousin. That's all. She paused, and then her expression changed to something more casual, almost too casual. And Luca Ferrante? Is he close to Alejandro? The question caught me by surprise, and I frowned. He's his right-hand man. Why? I saw a blush rise up Maggie's neck, and she quickly looked away. Nothing. Curiosity. She took a sip of champagne, still not looking directly at me. I just heard his name mentioned and got curious. There was something strange about the way she'd asked the question, something that put me on alert, even without knowing exactly why. Before I could investigate further, Alejandro returned, and Maggie quickly said goodbye with more excessive hugs and promises that we needed to meet up soon. The rest of the night passed in a strange fog, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way Maggie had asked about Luca, the way she'd blushed when she said his name. Later, when the event was ending and people were starting to leave, I saw Luca Ferrante beside Alejandro near the exit. He was tense, tenser than normal, and when his eyes met Maggie's from across the gallery, I saw something pass across his face that looked a lot like recognition and regret. "Boss," Luca said quietly to Alejandro, and I was close enough to hear. "That woman, Eleanor's cousin?" Alejandro asked, following Luca's gaze. "Yes, Luca hesitated, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Met at a party months ago on some random night." He paused, and his jaw tightened. She was intense, and I was an idiot. Alejandro was silent for a moment, looking from Luca to Maggie and back, and then his expression changed to something more serious. "More alert. Keep an eye out," he finally said, and there was a tone of warning in his voice that rarely appeared. Luca nodded, clearly understanding something I didn't fully comprehend yet. When we left the gallery later, in the car heading home, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation I'd heard. Maggie and Luca had met, had hooked up, and from the way Luca had spoken, it hadn't been a particularly positive experience. And now Maggie was back, asking questions about Alejandro, about Luca, showing up at events where she hadn't been specifically invited. There was something wrong there, something my instinct was screaming to pay attention to, but I couldn't identify exactly what. Alejandro must have noticed my worried expression, because he took my hand and held it as the car navigated through the streets of New York. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. I looked at him, at this man who had become so important in my life in such a short time, and forced a smile. "Yes, just tired." He didn't seem completely convinced, but didn't insist, just squeezed my hand a little tighter, and I tried to ignore the strange knot that had formed in my stomach since the moment Maggie had appeared. Chapter 7. Revelation of the Bentivoglio family.
I love you.
It was a Friday night in April, when everything changed in a way I didn't expect. Alejandro had asked me to come to his penthouse after work, said he wanted to talk about something important, and the tone in his voice had been different enough to make me nervous all day. Willow had noticed, obviously, because she always noticed when something was bothering me, but when she asked, I just said I didn't know what it was about, which was true. I had no idea. When I arrived at the penthouse at 7 in the evening, the sun was already setting over New York, painting the sky orange and pink through the huge floor-to-ceiling windows. Alejandro was sitting at the piano, playing a piece I didn't recognize, but that sounded melancholic and beautiful at the same time. He didn't stop when he saw me, just nodded toward the couch, a silent invitation for me to sit and wait. So I sat, taking off my shoes and tucking my legs underneath me, and just listened. The music filled the space between us, and I saw the way his fingers moved over the keys with that precision that came from decades of practice, the way he closed his eyes at certain moments, as if completely lost in the melody. When the last note finally dissipated in the air, he sat in silence for a few seconds before turning on the piano bench to face me. There was something on his face I couldn't fully identify, something like determination mixed with fear, and I felt my stomach tie in a knot. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice came out more serious than I was used to. "I need to tell you something about what I really am." I felt my heart race, but forced myself to keep my expression calm. I got up from the couch and went to the armchair closest to the piano, sitting and keeping my eyes fixed on him. I already know. Mafia. I saw the exact moment the words hit him. Alejandro became completely still, his eyes wide with genuine surprise, and when he spoke, his voice came out almost in a disbelieving whisper. "You knew? Since the first month." I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was beating irregularly in my chest. "I research. Remember?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Bentivoglio family, Bologna, legitimate businesses, and others. Current Dawn, you." I took a deep breath. "I know." Alejandro kept looking at me as if he were seeing a completely different person from the one he thought he knew. He slowly got up from the piano bench, taking a few steps in my direction before stopping, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration I rarely saw in him. "And you stayed?" The question came out loaded with something vulnerable, something that made my chest tighten. "You knew what I was, what I do, and still stayed?" I stood up too, closing the distance between us until we were just inches apart. "I stayed because I see what I see. Alejandro the man, not just the title, not just what you do." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating fast underneath. I see who you are when you play piano, when you talk about your mother, when you look at me like I'm the only person in the world who matters. I paused, feeling tears threaten my eyes. But I hear you. Tell me what you want to tell me. Alejandro took my hand that was on his chest, holding it firmly, and guided me back to the couch. We sat side by side, still holding hands, and for a long moment he just looked at our intertwined hands, as if gathering courage for the words he needed to say. My mother died when I was 8, he finally began, and his voice came out low, loaded with an old pain that had never completely healed. Rivals. They killed her to get to my father, to show that he was vulnerable, that he had weaknesses that could be exploited. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. I remember hearing the gunshots, running to her room and seeing everything. I squeezed his hand tighter, feeling tears begin to fall down my face silently. My father took over as Don after that, alone, without her by his side, and he was never the same. He was strong in business, ruthless when necessary. But emotionally, Alejandro opened his eyes, looking at the New York view through the windows. He died 5 years later. I was 13, and it wasn't an honorable death in battle or from old age. It was because a rival realized he was still emotionally vulnerable, that my mother's death had created a weakness that could be exploited. He turned to face me, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since we'd met. He died because he loved too much, because he allowed himself to feel, and I swore, at his funeral, that I would never make the same mistake. His voice faltered slightly. That's why I never allowed myself to feel, really, for anyone. Because weakness kills in my world, Eleanor. My father proved that. My mother paid the price for being loved too much. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with all that pain and fear he'd carried alone for so many years. I let go of his hand only so I could move closer, curling up on the couch so I could look directly into his eyes. And then, I asked softly, and then you appeared. He let out a humorless laugh, running his hand over his face. With your eyes shining when you talk about Italian history, with your shyness that hides a strength you don't even realize you have, with your purity and honesty in a world where everything is calculated and false. He looked at me, and I saw all that intensity that always left me breathless. And I tried to resist, rationally, told myself it was just attraction, just professional admiration, that it would pass. But it didn't. I completed for him. No, the word came out definitive. Because you're impossible to resist, Eleanor Carson. You came into my life as a competent employee, and somehow became the only thing that makes me want to risk everything I swore never to risk again. Tears were falling freely down my face now, and I made no effort to wipe them away. Alejandro, I understand the fear of losing, of being vulnerable, of loving someone so much that the possibility of losing them completely paralyzes you. I took his face between my hands, forcing him to look at me. I know that fear intimately, because I feel the same way about you. I saw something break in his eyes, some final defense he'd kept up until that moment. But we can't let fear steal everything, I continued, my voice coming out firm even through the tears. We can't let what happened to your parents determine the rest of our lives. Because if we do that, if we let fear win, then the rivals who took your mother and father from you win again. They rob you of the chance to be happy, and you know it. Alejandro was silent for long seconds, just looking at me with that intensity that always made me feel like I was being seen completely, without masks, without defenses. Then he held my wrists, keeping my hands on his face, and when he spoke, his voice came out hoarse and loaded with emotion. Yes, I know. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. And Eleanor, I love you. The world stopped, completely, terrifyingly, in a way that keeps me up at night, because I can't stop thinking about you, in a way that makes everything I swore about never falling in love seem ridiculous and insignificant. He moved one of his hands to touch my face, wiping away the tears with his thumb. I love you, Eleanor, and I'm scared, but I love you more than I'm afraid. I sobbed, a sound that was half laugh and half cry, and threw myself into his arms. I love you too, for so long. I laughed through the tears, hiding my face in his neck. Since that damn gray suit, I felt his body shake with laughter, and he pulled me back slightly just so he could look at me with a confused but amused expression. Suit? I covered my face with my hands, mortified at having mentioned that out loud. Don't ask. Oh, now I need to know. He pulled my hands away from my face, still laughing. What suit? The gray one, I murmured, my face probably red as a tomato. You wore it to a meeting early on, and I told Willow you looked like a Renaissance painting, and she never let me forget it. Alejandro let out a genuine laugh, the kind of laughter I rarely heard from him, free and real and completely unguarded. You compared me to a Renaissance painting? I was nervous, and you kept getting too close. And that suit was ridiculously well-tailored. I buried my face in my hands again, laughing and crying at the same time. This is so embarrassing. He pulled my hands again, this time not letting me hide, and when I looked at him, I saw so much love in his eyes it left me breathless. It's adorable, he said softly. You're adorable. And I can't believe I was lucky enough for you to look at me that way. Alejandro, I started, but he interrupted me with a kiss. It wasn't like the other kisses we'd shared over the last few months, those soft and careful kisses that always stopped before going too far. This was different. It was deep, real, loaded with all that emotion we'd just confessed to each other. I felt his hands on my face, in my hair, pulling me closer as if he couldn't get enough, and I responded with everything I had, with all the love I'd kept for so long. When we finally separated, we were both breathless, foreheads touching, eyes closed, just breathing in the same rhythm. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. Not like that. Just stay. Sleep here. Let me hold you. Let me wake up tomorrow and be sure this is real." I nodded, still unable to speak through the emotion blocking my throat. And that night, for the first time, I slept in Alejandro Bentivolio's arms, fully clothed, completely safe, and absolutely loved. And for the first time since my mother had died when I was 12, I didn't feel afraid of loving someone so much that losing them would destroy me, because he was right in saying that loving was scary, but I realized that living in fear was worse. Chapter 8. Maggie explodes and the Carson family.
You won't face this alone.
The week following that night was like living in a dream I didn't want to wake up from. Alejandro and I spent every night together, either at his penthouse or at my tiny Brooklyn apartment that he pretended not to find completely inadequate, even though I knew he was being polite. We talked late into the night about everything and nothing, fell asleep intertwined, and woke up with the certainty that we'd found something rare and precious that was worth any risk. On Saturday, we went to lunch at a small cafe in the West Village, one of those cozy places with sidewalk tables and a menu written by hand on a blackboard. It was a beautiful spring day, the sun pleasantly warm, and I was so happy I didn't even notice when Alejandro took my phone from the table and took a photo of us. "What are you doing?" I asked, laughing when I saw him analyzing the photo with that concentration he used for everything. "Recording," he simply replied, showing me the screen. It was a simple photo, both of us smiling, my head slightly tilted toward him, his hand visible holding mine on the table. Nothing over the top, nothing obvious, just us. "Can I post it?" I felt my stomach give a small nervous jump. Posting meant making it public, meant people would know, meant there would be no going back or pretending we were just boss and employee. But when I looked at him, at those dark eyes watching me with so much affection, the decision was easy. "You can," I replied, and saw the smile that spread across his face. He posted the photo on his Instagram with a simple caption in Italian that I had to mentally translate, "La mia luce," my light, and my heart completely melted. What I didn't expect was that this simple photo, this gesture of innocent happiness, would become the trigger for everything to fall apart. On Monday morning, I woke up with my phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. I was still at Alejandro's penthouse, wrapped in his silk sheets that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and he'd already left for an early meeting he couldn't cancel. I grabbed the phone half-dazed with sleep and saw 15 unread messages in the Carson family group chat. My stomach sank instantly. I opened the group with slightly trembling hands and started reading. Aunt Ruth, Maggie's mother, said, "Eleanor Marie Carson, I need you to call me immediately." "What is this story Maggie told me?" Uncle James replied. "Is this true, Eleanor? Are you dating a criminal?" Cousin Sarah chimed in. "I can't believe you sold yourself for money and position. Our family raised you better than that." Uncle Robert also gave his unsolicited 2 cents. "This is a sin, Eleanor. You're compromising your eternal soul." Grandma Margaret concluded. "I am deeply disappointed. Your mother would be ashamed." The messages continued, one after another, each crueler than the last. Accusations that I'd prostituted myself for a better job, that I was betraying family values, that I was involved with the Mafia out of greed and ambition. Messages quoting Bible verses about sin and redemption, about how I needed to repent and return to Oklahoma before it was too late. And in the middle of everything, a message from Maggie that was so fake it was nauseating. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry they found out this way. I was just worried about you and ended up mentioning it to Mom. I hope you understand it's all out of love." I felt tears start to fall before I even realized I was crying. I threw the phone on the bed as if it had burned me and curled my knees against my chest, trying to control the sobs that were coming out uncontrollably. It hurt. It hurt more than I expected because it was my family, the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally, and they had judged and condemned me without even bothering to ask for my side. Not one message asking if I was okay, not one call wanting to understand. Just accusations and disappointment and shame. My phone rang, and I saw Willow's name on the screen. I answered, sniffling, trying to control my voice. "Eleanor, did you see the group?" Her voice was loaded with concern. "I saw," I managed to say through the sobs. "I'm coming over. What's the address of Alejandro's penthouse?" I gave her the address with my voice shaking, and 20 minutes later, Willow was sitting next to me on the bed, hugging me while I cried on her shoulder. "This is Maggie, clearly," she said with anger in her voice. She saw the photo, got jealous, and ran to tell Aunt Ruth in the most damaging way possible. I know, I murmured, wiping my face with the back of my hand, but it hurts, because the family believes it, without even asking, without even trying to understand. I took a deep breath, feeling a new wave of sadness. And Alejandro, he's going to have to deal with their judgment. Conservative family from Oklahoma, who think he's the devil incarnate. They'll never accept him. Willow held my face between her hands, forcing me to look at her. Eleanor, do you care what they think? They're my family. They're people who judged you without knowing the full story, who believed gossip instead of trusting you. She wiped my tears with her thumbs. You have to decide what matters more, their approval or your own happiness. Before I could respond, I heard the sound of the private elevator opening and fast footsteps coming toward the bedroom. Alejandro appeared in the doorway, still wearing the suit he'd worn to the meeting, and stopped abruptly when he saw me. Eleanor, the way he said my name, loaded with concern and something like anger, made me start crying again. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside the bed and taking my face between his hands exactly as Willow had done, but his touch was different, more intimate, more devastated. What happened? Luca called me saying you were crying, that Willow had come running. His eyes went from my face to the phone thrown on the bed, and I saw the moment he understood. Your family. I tried to minimize it, tried to seem stronger than I felt. It's just family drama. I'll handle. You're crying, he interrupted me, and there was so much intensity in his eyes. It made me stop talking. I'm fine, I lied weakly. Alejandro didn't respond, just pulled me into a tight hug, and I crumbled again, crying into his chest while Willow discreetly left the room to give us privacy. He held me until the sobs diminished, one hand stroking my hair, the other firm on my back. When I finally managed to control myself enough to speak, I pulled back slightly and wiped my face with trembling hands. Alejandro moved to sit on the bed next to me, but kept one hand holding mine. They saw the photo, I explained with my voice still failing. And Maggie, she told my aunt, said I sold myself to you, that I'm with you for money and position, that I'm a disgrace to the family. More tears fell, and they believed it, without even asking, without even trying to understand. I saw Alejandro's jaw tighten, that expression he had when he was furious but controlling himself. He picked up the phone that was on the bed and read the messages in silence, and with each line he read, I saw the anger grow in his eyes. This is unacceptable, he finally said, his voice coming out controlled but dangerous. They have no right to talk to you like this, to make accusations without knowing the facts. Alejandro, he turned to face me completely, and then did something that caught me completely by surprise. He got off the bed and knelt on the floor in front of me, getting at eye level with me, holding my face between his hands with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his voice. Listen, he said, keeping his eyes fixed on mine. What your family thinks, it's legitimate pain. Don't minimize it. You have the right to be hurt, to be devastated, to feel betrayed by people who should support you unconditionally. He wiped my tears with his thumbs. But Eleanor, I face this with you. Not for you, with you. Understand? I nodded, unable to speak through the lump in my throat. If you want to go to Oklahoma and confront them in person, I'll go with you. If you want to cut contact, I support you. If you want to try to fix it, I'll be by your side through the whole process. He paused. But I won't let you face this alone. They're going to hate you, I whispered. They're conservative, religious, and now they think you're a criminal who corrupted me. Alejandro smiled, but there was no humor in it. I've been hated by worse. I can handle your family's disapproval. He was silent for a moment, and then his expression changed to something more serious, more calculating. And Eleanor, Maggie, she did this out of jealousy. Or is there something more? I remembered the way she'd asked about Luca at that event, the strange way she'd blushed. She asked about Luca at that event. I saw the moment Alejandro connected the dots, his expression becoming tenser. Luca told me they hooked up one night at a party months ago, and she was intense. He said it was a mistake. He paused, studying my face. That could be enough motivation for jealousy, or it could be something worse. Willow had returned to the room in time to hear the last part. What do you mean, worse? Alejandro got up from the floor but kept one hand in mine, pulling me to stand beside him. She knows you and I are serious, saw the photo, and that this isn't just a passing fling, and she had contact with Luca, even if briefly, which means she might have information, even if fragmented, about my organization. His expression became even more serious. In my world, information is currency, and jealous, resentful people are dangerous because they're unpredictable. I felt a chill down my spine. You think she'd do something beyond spreading gossip? I don't know, he replied honestly, but I'd rather be cautious. You stay with me, close security, for now. Alejandro, you're overreacting, I started, but was interrupted by his phone ringing. He looked at the screen and frowned. It's Luca, he answered, putting it on speaker. Luca, boss, we have a problem. Luca's voice was tense on the other end of the line. Volcaner family, the rivals from Naples. What about them? They found out you have a weakness. Eleanor's name is circulating in their conversations. Someone passed information. There was a significant pause. And boss? The source might have been someone close to someone close, if you know what I mean. Alejandro closed his eyes, his jaw tight. When did you find out about this? 10 minutes ago. Our internal contact with them just confirmed. Understood. Increase security. I want a full report in an hour. He hung up and turned to me, and the expression on his face was no longer worried boyfriend. It was Don making decisions that weren't open for discussion. Eleanor, he said, his voice coming out firm and leaving no room for argument. The Vulcaner family are serious rivals. Violent. If they found out you're important to me, you've become a target. He held my shoulders, forcing me to look directly at him. Your name is circulating in their conversations. Someone passed information, and I have a very strong suspicion of who the original source was, even if indirectly. Maggie, Willow said from across the room, her voice coming out shocked. She might have mentioned something to someone. Bar gossip, casual conversation. Doesn't matter. Information always leaks. Alejandro turned his attention completely to me. Eleanor, you stay with me. Penthouse. Maximum security all day. Final decision. Non-negotiable. I looked at him, at that expression that left no room for discussion, and understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't about family drama or cousin jealousy anymore. It was about my real safety, about really dangerous people who could use me to get to him. Okay, I finally said, and saw relief pass through his eyes. But Alejandro, we're going to solve this together. You promised. He pulled me into a tight hug, kissing the top of my head. Together, he confirmed. Always together. But while I was there, in his arms, hearing Willow call the office to let them know I'd be working remotely for the next few days, a single certainty formed in my mind. Maggie had gone too far, and consequences were coming.
Care to dance, Eleanor? I'd like that, Alejandro.
Chapter 9. Kidnapping and War. 5 days after Luca's call about the Vulcaners, I was going crazy from being stuck in the penthouse. Alejandro had been inflexible about security, and I understood. I really understood. But spending 5 whole days without going out, working remotely, seeing the world only through the huge windows was starting to suffocate me. So when he mentioned a charity event at the art gallery in Chelsea, a fundraising night for Italian artwork restoration, I practically begged to go. Eleanor, he started, and I already knew that tone. Please, it's a closed event, controlled guest list. You'll be there, and you can put whatever security you want. I held his hands, looking into his eyes with the most convincing expression I could make. Alejandro, I can't take being locked up here anymore. I know it's for security, but I'm going crazy. I saw the internal struggle happening on his face, concern battling against the desire to make me happy. Finally, he sighed. Okay, but Marco goes with you, and you don't leave my sight all night. Deal? Marco was one of Alejandro's security guards, a huge Italian man with an unfriendly face but who was surprisingly kind. I'd agreed quickly, relieved to finally be able to leave that penthouse. As beautiful as it was. The event was elegant, full of rich and influential people who wanted to be seen doing charity while drinking expensive champagne. Alejandro was on the other side of the gallery, talking to potential donors, and I was admiring a Caravaggio painting when I felt my phone vibrate in my clutch pocket. It was a message from Willow, asking how the event was going, and I headed toward the small garden at the back of the gallery to call her where the noise would be lower. Marco was right behind me, keeping a respectful distance but always alert. That's when I heard the commotion coming from the garden entrance. I turned in time to see 2 men appear, one of them throwing something on the ground that exploded with a blinding flash and thick smoke that spread quickly. Marco shouted something in Italian, moving in my direction, but another man appeared out of nowhere and hit him with something that made him fall to the ground. I tried to run, scream, do anything, but strong arms grabbed me from behind, a large hand covering my mouth before I could make any sound. I struggled, kicked, tried to bite the hand holding me, but it was useless. They were too strong, too trained. I felt a prick in my neck, something being injected, and the world started to blur at the edges. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Marco trying to get up from the ground, blood running down his forehead, screaming something I couldn't understand, and then nothing. I woke up with my head throbbing and my mouth dry, lying on a cold concrete floor. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust to the low light, and when I could finally focus, I realized I was in some kind of abandoned warehouse. The windows were dirty and broken. There were old boxes piled in corners, and the smell of mold and dampness was strong enough to make me feel nauseous. I tried to move and realized my hands were tied behind my back, and my ankles were also bound. Panic began to grow in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe deeply and stay calm. Panicking wasn't going to help anything. The little princess woke up. A voice with a strong Italian accent came from somewhere behind me, and I heard footsteps approaching. A man appeared in my field of vision, maybe 40 years old, with scars on his face and cold eyes that observed me as if I were just merchandise. He crouched in front of me, and I forced myself not to pull back, even though every instinct was screaming to do so. "You're going to make a little video for us, Bella," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "A message for your boyfriend. Don Bentivoglio needs to understand he can't have everything he wants." He picked up a phone and pressed the record button. pointing the camera at me. Tell him you're okay, that he shouldn't do anything stupid. Understand? I looked directly at the camera, at Alejandro, who I knew would be watching, and forced myself to keep my voice steady, even though I was terrified. I'm okay. Don't do anything that— The man interrupted me, turning the camera to himself. Don Bentivoglio, North Manhattan Territories, 20 million in an offshore account. You have 24 hours. He smiled, cruel and satisfied. Or your woman discovers what it's like to be vulnerable, like your mother was. The mention of Alejandro's mother made me feel anger mixed with fear. They knew exactly where to attack, exactly how to cause the most pain. The man turned off the video and left, leaving me alone in the cold, dark warehouse. And all I could do was wait and trust that Alejandro would come, because he always came. Alejandro was talking to an art collector about a 15th century piece when Luca appeared beside him with an expression that made his blood freeze instantly. Without excusing himself to the collector, he stepped away, following Luca to a more private corner of the gallery. Talk, Alejandro said, keeping his voice low but feeling adrenaline already starting to pump through his veins. Marco was attacked. Eleanor was taken 3 minutes ago. Luca extended a phone. They sent this. Alejandro took the phone and pressed play on the video, and felt like the ground had disappeared from under his feet when he saw Eleanor on the screen. She was tied up, clearly scared, but maintaining her composure in a way that would have filled him with pride in any other circumstance. I'm okay. Don't do anything that— And then the voice. That damn voice with a Neapolitan accent he recognized immediately. Vulcaner, North Territories, 20 million. And then the threat about his mother, calculated to provoke exactly the reaction it was provoking. Fury, cold, calculated, absolutely terrifying. Alejandro returned the phone to Luca, and when he spoke, his voice came out so quiet and controlled, it was more dangerous than any shout could be. All available men. Immediate tracking. I want a location in 15 minutes. He paused, his eyes becoming even colder. And Luca, Maggie Carson. Bring her here. Now. She knew Eleanor would be at this event. She provided the information. He saw guilt pass across Luca's face. Panic in his eyes. Boss, I didn't know she— I know you didn't know. Alejandro interrupted him, keeping his voice controlled. That's why you live. That's why you still work for me. You were used, manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to do it. He took a step closer. But now you're going to fix it. You will. Luca left practically running, and Alejandro stood there for a moment, allowing himself 3 seconds of pure terror before pushing the emotion to the back of his mind and letting the dawn take over completely. Eleanor was in danger, and he was going to bring her back, no matter the cost. 30 minutes later, Alejandro was in the gallery's private office when Luca returned, practically dragging Maggie Carson by the arm. She was visibly terrified, her eyes wide when she saw Alejandro standing near the window, hands in his pockets, expression completely empty of emotion, which was infinitely more terrifying than if he were visibly furious. Sit, he said, his voice coming out too calm. Maggie sat in the chair Luca pushed toward her, her hands visibly trembling. Alejandro, I didn't— You knew Eleanor would be at this event tonight, he interrupted her, still not raising his voice, still maintaining that deadly calm. Because I mentioned it at the office, in front of several people, and you were there, visiting Luca. He saw the color drain from her face. You passed that information to someone, for money, for revenge. I don't care about the reason. He finally moved, walking slowly toward her until he was standing directly in front of the chair. Eleanor was kidnapped 40 minutes ago, by people who knew exactly where she'd be, exactly when, exactly how security would be positioned. I didn't know they were going to kidnap her, Maggie exploded, tears starting to fall. They just asked for information, said it was just to scare you. They paid me $5,000 and I thought— You thought what? Alejandro's voice cut like a blade, still low, but loaded with ice. That betraying my family, putting Eleanor in danger, wouldn't have consequences. Maggie was sobbing now, words coming out jumbled. I was jealous, okay? She has everything. You, the perfect job, the perfect life, and I have nothing. Luca used me and threw me away. You don't even look at me, and Eleanor just has everything without even trying. Where are they? Alejandro said, and it wasn't a question. Now, you know. He saw hesitation on her face, the last vestige of self-preservation battling against fear. Where? He didn't shout, but the tone of absolute command in his voice made Maggie practically jump from the chair. Warehouse in Brooklyn. Ferreira Street, number 44. I swear I didn't want her to get hurt. I just wanted you to see that she brings danger, that she's not good for you. Alejandro was already leaving, Luca right behind him, leaving Maggie alone in the office with 2 guards at the door. In the car on the way to Brooklyn, Luca looked at him with concern. Boss, it could be a trap. They might be waiting for you to go personally. I don't care, Alejandro replied, checking the gun he kept in the holster under his suit. If it's a trap, it's a trap. But I'm going. Personally, because Eleanor was his, and no one touched what was his without paying the price. The rescue was quick, professional, and almost frighteningly efficient. Alejandro's men surrounded the warehouse in less than 5 minutes, eliminating the external guards without a single shot being fired. When they finally broke down the main door, they found Eleanor exactly where Maggie had said she'd be, tied up, but unharmed, and only 3 men inside who were quickly subdued. Alejandro crossed the warehouse in long, quick strides, kneeling beside her and cutting the ropes binding her hands and feet with a knife he pulled from his pocket. When she was free, Eleanor threw herself into his arms, and he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I've got you," he whispered in her ear, pressing her against his chest. "You're okay. I've got you." He felt her body shake with silent sobs, her hands clutching at his suit as if afraid he'd disappear. "I knew you'd come," she said through the tears, her voice muffled against his chest. "I knew." Alejandro pulled back just enough to look at her, to verify with his own eyes that she was really okay, that she had no injuries beyond some scratches on her wrists where the ropes had been too tight. He kissed her forehead, then her hair, then her tear-wet cheeks. "Always," he promised, his voice coming out hoarse with emotion. "Understand? I always come. For you. Always." And as he carried her out of that horrible warehouse, back to the safety of the armored car waiting, Alejandro made a silent promise. The Volcaners would pay, Maggie would pay, and he'd make sure nothing like this happened again, no matter the cost. Chapter 10. Real Confrontation and Purity.
We go at your pace.
That transforms the first days after the kidnapping passed in a fog of intermittent sleep, and Alejandro refusing to leave my side. He'd canceled everything again, ignored important calls, postponed meetings that probably cost millions, all to sit at the edge of the bed watching me as if afraid I'd disappear. It was on the afternoon of the 3rd day when I finally asked the thing that had been circling my mind. "And Maggie?" I saw his fingers stop typing on the laptop. His jaw tightened slightly. He closed the computer before turning completely to face me. And when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Safe. But far away." He paused, choosing his words. "She's going to start over somewhere else. Seattle, with legal consequences for what she did. Criminal records that will make sure she thinks twice before doing something like this again." Another pause. "But alive. For you." I frowned. "For me?" Alejandro came to sit on the edge of the bed, taking my hand. "You wouldn't want me to be harsher with her, even though she deserved much more than she's getting." He looked at our joined hands. "You soften me, Eleanor Carson. It's extremely inconvenient." The comment was so unexpected, I couldn't hold back the laugh that escaped. It was the first time I'd laughed since the kidnapping, and the sound seemed strange after days of tears. "Inconvenient?" I repeated, still laughing. Alejandro smiled. Small but genuine. "Very. I was significantly more efficient without feelings. Decisions were simpler when I didn't have to consider how you'd feel about them." The laughter died, replaced by something more serious. "You were more efficient," I agreed softly, "and infinitely more alone." I saw the moment the words hit him. He became completely still before nodding. "Yes, both. Efficient and completely alone." He kissed my fingers. "I prefer inconvenient." In the following days, we established a strange routine. Alejandro worked from the apartment while I recovered, and I spent afternoons reading, trying to work remotely, and mostly just existing in the same space as him. It was on a Thursday afternoon, almost a week later, that everything changed. I was restless from sitting still, and my eyes landed on the piano, that beautiful piano that had belonged to his mother, that represented memories and connection to something he'd lost so long ago. I looked around, checking if Alejandro was busy in the office, and then approached the instrument with my heart beating faster. I sat on the bench, my hands hovering over the keys, and thought about all those YouTube videos I'd secretly watched. 2 chords. That was all I'd managed to learn, practicing silently when I was sure no one would hear me. I placed my fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and played. C major, 3 notes together, and then E major, 3 more notes. "You said you didn't play." I almost jumped off the bench, turning quickly and finding Alejandro standing in the office doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. I felt my face catch fire. "I said I didn't play piano." Technically true, this isn't playing. It's pressing keys in a minimally coordinated way. I looked away, but I learned 2 chords, with YouTube, to impress someone. The silence made me look back, and I saw that Alejandro was smiling openly and genuinely. He crossed the room and stopped beside the bench. "You learned piano chords," he said, "to impress me." Still mortified, I replied. "I neither confirm nor deny." Alejandro let out a low laugh, and then sat on the bench beside me, our bodies touching from shoulder to hip in that small space. "Teach me the chords?" he asked. I looked at him with disbelief. I teach you? You who've played since you were 7? You learned from me, he replied simply. I learn with you. Seems fair. There was something so sincere in that I felt tears threaten. I blinked quickly and carefully took his right hand. C major, like this. I positioned his fingers on the correct keys, pressed together. He pressed, and the sound filled the space between us. I saw the moment something changed in his eyes, when he realized my hand was still over his, guiding, touching. There was an intimacy in that which was different from everything we'd shared. And now, he asked, his voice lower. E major, like this. I moved his hand to the next keys, positioning each finger. I felt the warmth of his skin, the way he let me guide completely. Our fingers touched the keys together, my hand still over his, and the sound was imperfect, but perfect. And this is impressive? He asked. The two together? Yes. C and E. I played the chords in sequence. Hear it? Alejandro was silent, and when I looked at him, I saw he wasn't looking at the keys. He was looking at me. Yes, he finally said. I hear it. The moment stretched, loaded, me looking at him looking at me, our hands still on the keys. Alejandro moved his free hand, touching my face, and when he spoke, each word came out measured. Eleanor, you know there's no rush. There never will be, but I want you to know something. Pause. When and if you want anything with me, any next step, I'll take care of you, with all the attention you deserve. No rush, no expectation, no pressure. His eyes on mine, just you, being you. In your time, always. The tears finally fell, silent, not from sadness, but from gratitude for having found someone who understood. Thank you, I whispered, for understanding, for not pressuring me, for being patient. Alejandro wiped my tears. Thank you, he replied, vulnerable, for teaching me it's worth it, waiting for something real. He rested his forehead against mine. You taught me that intimacy isn't just physical. It's this, hands on keys, simple chords that mean everything. I closed my eyes, feeling the moment, the absolute certainty that I'd found something rare. And that afternoon, sitting at his mother's piano, with two simple chords still echoing in the air, something solidified between us, the peace of true love. Chapter 11, Bologna.
It's always you.
My life had become something I never would have imagined possible that morning when I first arrived at the Bentivoglio group office as a nervous intern. Alejandro and I had found a rhythm that worked, building layers of intimacy and trust that went far beyond the physical, learning each other in ways most people never bothered to learn. My family had started to reconcile with me, slowly, after Alejandro had personally gone to Oklahoma and talked to my grandmother for 3 hours about his intentions, his family, and how he planned to take care of me. There was still resistance, still judgment from some more conservative uncles, but at least the hate messages had stopped. It was a Friday in October when Alejandro found me in the office with that expression I'd learned to recognize as him planning something. Eleanor, I want to take you somewhere. I looked up from the reports. Milan? You always talk about Bologna. The word fell between us like a stone in water, creating waves of meaning that took me a few seconds to fully process. Bologna, his hometown, the Bentivoglio family origin, the place he rarely visited because it carried too many memories. Bologna, I repeated, feeling the weight of that. Your family, your real home. Alejandro approached, resting his hands on my desk and leaning slightly forward. I want you to see where I come from. Real, not books, not research. The stone, the air, the afternoon light that Renaissance painters tried to capture for centuries. He paused, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes. I want to show you what shaped all this, he pointed to himself, so you can decide if you want this world, completely, without doubts. 3 days later, we were in a car leaving the Bologna airport, driving down narrow roads lined with vineyards and olive trees that seemed not to have changed in centuries. When we finally arrived at the old Bentivoglio family estate, I stopped at the entrance and just looked. It was exactly as I'd imagined from the books, but infinitely better. Medieval stone warmed by the afternoon sun, meticulously maintained gardens where climbing roses went up old walls, a fountain in the center of the courtyard with crystal water falling softly, living history, breathing in every detail. It's exactly how I imagined it, I whispered, feeling tears threaten from pure beauty. But better, much better. Alejandro was standing beside me, but wasn't looking at the estate. He was looking at me, watching my reaction with that intensity that always left me breathless. I saw something resolve in his eyes, as if my reaction had answered some question he'd been asking silently. That afternoon, he took me to the garden at the back of the property, where an antique piano was positioned near a pergola covered with wisteria. It was smaller than the one in the New York penthouse, clearly old but impeccably maintained. It was hers, Alejandro said simply, running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. My mother played here every afternoon when the weather was good. I sat on a nearby bench without saying anything, just waiting, and he began to play. The music that came out was different from everything I'd heard him play before. It was melancholic, but beautiful, simple, but deeply emotional, and I closed my eyes just letting it envelop me completely. When the last note finally dissipated in the wisteria-scented air, I opened my eyes and saw he was watching me. "Who taught you that piece?" I asked softly. "My mother." His voice came out hoarse. "She would have really liked you, Eleanor." I felt tears return, but this time I let them fall. "Tell me about her?" And he did. For 2 hours, sitting in that garden while the sun slowly set over Bologna, Alejandro told me everything. About the mother who played piano and laughed loudly and filled the house with flowers. About the father who loved her so much he became too vulnerable. About the 8-year-old boy who saw everything fall apart and swore never to feel that pain again. About how he became Don. About the price he paid. About the sacrifices he made. I listened to everything without interrupting, without judging, just holding his hand and letting the words come out after decades of being kept inside. When he finally finished, we stayed in silence for long minutes. Then Alejandro took a small box from his jacket pocket, old and worn by time. This was my mother's. He opened the box, revealing a gold ring with a sapphire in the center. Simple, but absolutely beautiful. She told me, before she died, that when I found someone who made me feel without fear of feeling, I would know, and I should give this ring to her. His eyes met mine. "I know, Eleanor. I've known since that elevator, since that terrified and courageous confession. I know it's you." My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. "It's not a formal proposal. Not today," he continued, his voice coming out soft. "Today is a promise that this ring exists, and one day at the right time, in your time, I'll ask officially. But I want you to know it's you. It always was. Since," he smiled, and there was humor in his eyes, "since the gray suit." I froze. "You know about the suit?" Willow told me, months ago. He was clearly enjoying my horror. "I'm going to kill Willow." Alejandro laughed, loud and real and completely free, and the sound was so beautiful I couldn't keep pretending to be annoyed. I laughed too, through the tears, and then stopped, looking at him with all the certainty I felt. "Alejandro, you can put on the ring. Now. The right time?" I took a deep breath. "Is now." I saw shock pass across his face. "Eleanor, I came to Bologna, saw your origins, heard your story, know your world, and I love you completely, with all the purity I still have and all the strength I'm learning." I held his hands. "So, yes, now." Alejandro took the ring with hands that trembled slightly, and when he started to slide it onto my finger, I saw he was really shaking. "You're shaking," I observed, amazed. Apparently, he laughed humorlessly. "You do this to me. Inconvenient." And then he kissed me, there in the family garden in Bologna, with the golden light of the Italian afternoon bathing everything around us, and it was the most perfect kiss we'd ever shared. 1 year later, the wedding was small, just close family and intimate friends in the same garden where he'd proposed to me. I was wearing a simple cream dress, the sapphire shining on my finger, and Alejandro was in a dark suit, eyes only for me. Willow had been crying since the ceremony started, sniffling loud enough to make some people laugh. "I knew it," she whispered when I passed her. "Since the gray suit." "Shut up, Willow," I murmured, but I was smiling. The vows were simple but profound. Alejandro talked about how I'd entered his life and returned things he thought were lost. I talked about stopping running and learning that love wasn't weakness. It was the rarest strength that existed. And when they declared us married and he kissed me in that garden full of history and promises, I felt like everything had finally fallen into place. That night, at the window of the room that had been his mother's, I looked at Bologna illuminated under the moon, the ring shining on my finger. "What are you thinking about?" Alejandro asked, hugging me from behind. "That I almost didn't say it. In the elevator. Almost swallowed it all back. But you did." "I did." I turned to face him. "And you didn't laugh, didn't reject. You hugged me. I'll always hug you." He kissed my neck softly. "It's my favorite occupation." I laughed. "More than being Don?" "Infinitely more." Pause. "Eleanor? Thank you. For saving this." He touched my heart. "For someone who deserved it. For deciding I deserved it. You deserve everything, and then some." I touched his face. "And Alejandro, you played piano today. At the ceremony. Your mother's piece." His eyes welled up. "Yes. She'd be proud. Of the man you chose to be. I'm sure of it." Alejandro didn't respond with words. He just kissed me, slowly, with everything he had, with years of waiting and fear and repressed love finally free to be felt completely. And I responded, with all the confidence he'd taught me to have, all the strength I'd discovered I always had. Bologna, open window, history continuing, and I was finally home. Fun facts you might not have noticed. Eleanor never said "I love you" first. In Chapter 7, Alejandro declares, and she responds crying, "I love you too," maintaining her insecurity until the end. The word inconvenient was used 2 times by Alejandro. Chapter 8, you soften me, it's inconvenient. And Chapter 10, about her making him tremble, practically becoming his love declaration. The crucial elevator appears only in Chapter 4. A single moment over 40 floors changed the entire trajectory of the relationship Maggie had only one direct scene. Chapter 6. At the event, then she's only mentioned by others until disappearing to Seattle. Eleanor ordered tea instead of coffee in Chapter 5. a small personality detail that Alejandro memorized. The first time Eleanor called just Alejandro was in Chapter 2, in the car returning from dinner with Marco Fiore, without Sir or Mr. Bentivoglio Luca appears in 4 chapters, but never has direct dialogue with Eleanor, always mediated by Alejandro, or mentioned by others. The 2 chords, C and E, from Chapter 10, are the only ones Eleanor learned. Months of dating, and she only knew 2 basic chords. The gray suit was mentioned in 3 non-consecutive chapters. Chapter 1, Willow's Joke. Chapter 7, Confession since the gray suit. And Chapter 11, Revelation that Willow told. And if you want to watch another great love story, full of emotion, click on the video appearing on your screen right now.